Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss carrier proteins and how they relate to what we've been talking about lately with hormones and the endocrine system. So what we've been learning about hormones is that, by definition, a hormone travels through the bloodstream in order to gain access to cells throughout the body that are targets for that hormone. And what that really means is that those target cells, what makes them a target, is that they have the right receptor for that particular hormone. So another thing that we learned in our previous video on classes of hormones is that some hormones are hydrophilic and some hormones are hydrophobic. Okay, so we talked about the three different classes of hormones. Some of them are hydrophilic. In fact, most of them are hydrophilic, but there are definitely some important hydrophobic hormones. The question I have for you at this point is, do you see the problem with this? Do you see the key fundamental problem with saying that, by definition, every hormone has to travel through the bloodstream, yet some hormones are hydrophobic? Okay, let's delve into this a little bit. So if you don't see the problem yet, let me kind of lead you there by asking some really basic questions. The first question, how do hormones travel to their target cells? Okay, so we've learned already that what makes a hormone is that hormones travel through the bloodstream. If a signaling molecule travels to its target, but it does not go through the bloodstream, it is not acting as a hormone. Okay, next question, what is the principal molecular constituent of the blood? So that's kind of a fancy schmancy way of asking, what's the main thing that you find in the blood? If you made a list of all the different things that you find in the blood, what's the major thing that you find there? What's the most common thing you're going to find there? And of course the answer there is water, right? Water is the most common, most principal, most major component of the bloodstream and any body fluid that we could potentially talk about, whether it's extracellular fluid or intracellular fluid. Okay, so hormones travel through the bloodstream, and the bloodstream is mostly made of water. Okay, so final question I have for you here. Some hormones are hydrophobic. What is it that they are afraid of, in scare quotes? And of course the answer there is water. So hopefully you're seeing what the problem here is. Okay, we have hormones that are hydrophobic. They don't like water, yet by definition, because they're hormones, they have to travel through the bloodstream, which contains a lot of water. So what we need to kind of explain here, the conundrum we need to rectify here, is how is it that hydrophobic hormones are traveling through the bloodstream when the bloodstream contains a ton of water? So let's go ahead and address that. So the way we're going to solve this little conundrum here is with carrier proteins. So if you look at the definition here, a carrier protein is a protein found in the blood plasma that has multiple hydrophobic binding pockets for transporting hydrophobic substances, doesn't have to be hormones, through the aqueous plasma environment. So it turns out that your bloodstream actually contains quite a few different hydrophobic substances, not just steroid hormones, but also fats and triglycerides and fatty acids and things of that nature. Those hydrophobic substances are able to be transported through the bloodstream because of carrier proteins. So there are quite a few different carrier proteins that we could talk about, but the most common one that does most of what we're going to kind of talk about is called albumin. And then a second one we'll go ahead and mention that has kind of a niche role in transporting thyroid hormone is called thyroid binding globulin, or TBG. So we'll cover that in a future lesson on the thyroid and thyroid hormone. But for now, you'll hopefully remember that thyroid hormone, despite being an amine hormone, is hydrophobic, so it's definitely going to need a carrier to transport it around through the bloodstream. So some substrates that you will see carried around by these carrier proteins are not just steroid hormones, not just T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, but also fatty acids, triglycerides, fatty hydrophobic substances that would not do well by themselves in an aqueous environment. So if you're having kind of a hard time visualizing and conceptualizing what the carrying part of this actually looks like, take a look here. So if you look at the carrier protein that is illustrated here, what I am showing you here with the color coding here is the chemical properties of the amino acid side chains that are pointed outward from this carrier protein. So most of these amino acid side chains are hydrophilic. So this allows for the carrier protein itself to interact very well with the water that's in the blood plasma. But you'll notice here it does have this little binding pocket here that is lined and coated with hydrophobic side chains. This will allow it to carry and shield this steroid hormone here and shield it away from the water that is everywhere else in the blood plasma. So as it says here, the carrier protein itself needs to be soluble in the water, but its main job is it needs to protect and shield that hydrophobic steroid hormone or thyroid hormone or fatty acid away from all that nasty, mean old water that's in the blood plasma. So what the benefit of a carrier protein is that they will allow an otherwise insoluble in water molecule that would have a hard time being soluble in the bloodstream to actually be carried around through the bloodstream. But here is kind of an extra conundrum. If you've already thought about this, then you're kind of a master chess player. You're already 2 or 3 steps ahead of us. So we'll go ahead and address this next issue. The next issue is that as long as these hormones are in a bound state, as long as they're basically being bear hugged by these carrier proteins, these hydrophobic hormones cannot be delivered to their target cells. So that's the real issue. How does the delivery of the hormone occur? So let's take a look at that. Okay, so we know that hydrophobic hormones are not very soluble in water, and therefore they have to be chaperoned all over the place by carrier proteins like albumin. So I have this listed here as a binding protein, and you can see this steroid hormone, as we'll call it, is in a bound state. So what's going to happen in order for this hormone to be delivered to its target cell? It needs to become a free hormone. It needs to detach itself from the carrier protein, and then this free hormone needs to diffuse through the fenestration between these endothelial cells to get into the interstitial fluid, and then from there it can enter into its target cell, which should be nearby. So it says here, most hydrophobic hormone will be bound by a carrier, but there will be a very small fraction or very small proportion of that hormone that will exist as an unbound free population that actually is capable of diffusing towards its target cells. Now, it's not going to be a big fan of doing this because you can see this free hormone is being forced to interact with water, but if we do this correctly, that free hormone is not going to have to interact with water for very long. So the proportions here are something like 99% to 1%. So if you counted up all of this particular steroid hormone in the blood, 99% of it's being carried by a carrier protein. The other 1% is just freely floating around in the bloodstream. And the fact that that proportion is so heavily shifted towards the bound state really illustrates just how much this hormone doesn't really like water. If it liked water, then this would be closer to 1% to 99% instead of 99% to 1%. Okay? So this free population, as I said, is necessary because this is the only population of the hormone that's going to be capable of being delivered to the target cells, which are somewhere up here past the blood vessel and in that interstitial fluid. So here is how this works. Delivery of the hydrophobic hormone to the target cells outside the bloodstream shifts the binding equilibrium to the right. Now, before we go any further on that thought, you might be thinking, okay, well, if it's this 1% that's being delivered, that's not very efficient. We've got a total of 100% of this hormone in the blood, and we're only delivering 1% of it. Well, you're starting to think about it in the right way, but we're missing something here. No, we're not just delivering 1%. We are delivering from that 1% population. So when this 1% gets delivered to the target cells, this percentage goes down to 0%. And something you hopefully learned in your general chemistry, something either called the law of mass action or Le Chatelier's principle, is that when you do something to disrupt an equilibrium process, the equilibrium will shift in order to correct that imbalance. So when we deliver this 1%, instead of having 99% to 1%, we then now have 100% to 0%. The shift here that we're going to see as a result of Le Chatelier's principle is that delivery of this hormone out of the bloodstream is going to coerce hormone that's in the bound state to unbind itself to get us back to 99% to 1%. So that will cause more hormone to be delivered, more hormone to unbind itself, more hormone to be delivered. So eventually, it's not going to be the fastest process in the world, but eventually a lot of this 99% population is going to eventually get delivered to target cells. It just has to go through the process of unbinding itself and then getting delivered. So it's the delivery of that 1% that convinces or coerces the bound population to unbind itself and join the 1% population. Okay, so we're almost done with this topic, but the question is, which hormones will need carriers? So hopefully this should be fairly obvious. The hormones that will need carrier proteins to be transported through the bloodstream are obviously the hydrophobic ones, or at the very least the ones that we've already gone out of our way to say are hydrophobic. That's the steroid hormones, the ones produced by the adrenal cortex and the gonads. We'll cover those in future videos. And then T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, which again, we'll cover those in future videos as well. Those are the hydrophobic hormones. They will require carriers like albumin or like TBG in order to transport them around through the bloodstream. So anything else is not going to need a carrier protein. Anything that is a hydrophilic hormone like peptides, proteins, glycoproteins, catecholamines, these are all very soluble, very hydrophilic hormones. They have no problem being transported through the aqueous blood plasma. So as such, they will not need carrier proteins. Okay, so obviously we're kind of a little light on vocabulary here. If you found the topic of the equilibrium shifting a little bit confusing, you may want to look into the law of mass action or Le Chatelier's principle for a little bit of a refresher on how that works. And then for checking your understanding, number one, why do some hormones require carrier proteins and others do not? Pretty easy one to answer, I believe. And number two, how are hydrophobic hormones delivered to target cells from a bound state in the plasma? Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section. Otherwise, I will see you for the next video. So long.